What we do here is go back.
Hi, and welcome to Mr. Toyama's AP World History. This is Chapter 32, The Building of Global Empires. First off, we have our overview. In the latter half of the 19th century, the industrial powers of Western Europe swiftly extended their control over vast areas of Africa and Asia. This new imperialism was rationalized by theories of racial and cultural superiority. It was made possible by new technologies of warfare. The United States and Japan, to a lesser extent Russia, were late arrivals on the imperial stage but soon established themselves as well. Modern imperialism is characterized by the following. Mixed motives. Imperial powers claimed economic necessity, strategic imperatives, and a high-minded, civilizing mission. Frequently, motives were confused, so it became the white man's burden to convert Africans to Christianity while at the same time enslaving them. Competition between imperial powers. The scramble for Africa and later for the Pacific Islands illustrate the intense competition among the imperial nations. The United States took over the Philippines in order to be on an equal footing with other powers already in China. Japan seized Korea and Taiwan for the same reason. Different models of colonial rule. In practice, the new imperialism varied considerably, including settler colonies such as Australia, indirect rule as in British Africa, direct rule as in French Indochina, and even private fiefdom of Leopold II in the Belgian Congo. In all cases, the ultimate authority rested with the imperial state, and local rulers had little real power. Economic colonialism. The purpose of the colony was to supply cheap, raw commodities to the imperialist state and to be a market for manufactured goods. All resources, natural and human, were directed to this effort. Forests were transformed into plantation, and workers impressed into service. There was no effort to develop colonial industry that might compete with the imperial state. Contempt for local cultures. With few exceptions, the imperial powers regarded colonial people as their inferiors and treated them as such. The French made an effort to convert and educate colonial peoples. The British also employed colonials as soldiers and minor civil servants, but made little provision for education. This disrespect contributed to a growing nationalism in India. All right, so first up, we're going to have the big idea section. There are some words here that we need to kind of focus in on for this chapter. First up, we have imperialism. Now, remember, imperialism we talked about last chapter as the Europeans going specifically into the Ottoman Empire, really resisting Russia's attempts to take over bigger portions of western parts of the Middle East, and also some of the other areas like Japan and China, as it was kind of modified and taken over sections of their territory by Western Europeans. Well, now we're going to look at the bigger global stage that comes about as a result of this imperialism, specifically in the areas of British in India, Western Europe, and the whole scramble for Africa as the whole continent of Africa is carved up, the Pacific Islands, the USA entering the global stage and basically moving into the Philippines, Hawaii, and into different parts of the world. And this will eventually set the stage for future nationalistic movements, which have become known as anti-colonial or anti-imperial movements. The biggest reason for this imperialism was really raw materials or resources. As these imperial powers went around the world, one of their biggest goals was to try and get more resources in a number of different ways, in an eclectic amount of ways, to be able to support their growing empire and also to grow really their power and their power base at home. There was a technological advantage that was really lorded over some of these imperialized nations and imperialized areas of the globe, as the Western Europeans were using the factory system and the Industrial Revolution to make themselves more profitable and to be able to advance themselves technologically. They were able to use their weaponry and their trade networks that they are establishing through the plundering of different colonized lands to be able to increase their power throughout the globe. We then get to an imbalance of power in Europe, specifically between certain nations and around the globe, as Western European nations pretty much take over most of the world that wasn't industrialized by this point. All right, so first up we have imperialism in Asia around 1914, right before on the eve of World War I. In green, you can see Great Britain has taken over most of what we would call today India. There's parts of Burma, there's Malay states, British Borneo, Kashmir up in 1846. We have France, pretty much where Vietnam is today. We have Japan, pretty much pushing its way into the Korean Peninsula. The United States has taken over the Philippine Islands on the eve of World War I. We have the Netherlands, who have taken over what they are now calling the Dutch East Indies. Russia has pushed down south from their northern part above China into what is today Mongolia. Portugal has really only East Timor in a very small area in the bottom right. And then we have the princely states of India, which were semi-independent kingdoms within the British power that was ruling India. Now, as you can see, most of Southeast Asia has been carved up in a number of ways between only a handful of different powers that have chosen specifically as a part of this new age to industrialize. All of those countries on that list pretty much have used a considerable amount of time, resources, and energy to be able to manufacture goods and to be able to specifically manufacture weaponry that will be able to help them in successfully taking over these areas of the globe. Now, the idea of imperialism is a term that dates back from the 19th century. It became popular in the discourse by the 1880s. Really, it's focused on military imperialism. It later gets its varieties of economic and cultural imperialism. But really, military imperialism is this. If you were a country during the time we're talking about right now, around the late 1800s, what you're looking around the world and seeing is that your trade networks that you had previously been a part of still are active, but you're actually getting more and more advanced in the technology producing. And with that advanced technology comes the ability to kind of use that power that you're producing to kind of bully people. And you really use that power to go around the world and make treaties or take what you want by force. This is spurred on by a number of different reasons, but really it starts off with basically cultures and societies that industrialized earlier, have better technology, and use that power to be able to take over bigger parts of the globe and add it to what they're starting to build, which is larger empires. Similar to the empires that we saw with, say, the Persians or the Babylonians or the Romans. They really were expanding through their use of military might to be able to incorporate larger sections of the globe into their empire for economic resources. Now, later, we're going to get to how through this military power, people are going to be able to use the goods that they find there and the actual labor of the people there to be able to make money, and this will lead to unfair treaties, unfair trade deals, and in a lot of ways make those cultures that we're talking about with that power more rich as a result of that process. And finally, as they go around the world, there's going to be cultural imperialism. Through this process we'll talk about at the end, called social Darwinism, people of Europe, specifically Western Europe, start to say that the cultures that they're running into are inferior or savage in a lot of ways, and what they need to do is bring about civilization to those people. We talked about last chapter the idea of the West. And now the West is kind of a mixture of different ideas and different belief systems that kind of have informed Western Europe and North America, specifically the United States and Canada, and a couple other regions of the globe. This is set about a specific type of thinking within Western Europe that their culture is the best culture to have existed on the earth. It has a long documented tradition that we've talked about. And for a lot of them, they really see the world as kind of in need of their authority, and to be able to go around the world and show people that really the way they're doing things is wrong, and the way that the Western Europeans, with their Judeo-Christian values, with their Western mindset, really is a more valuable way of looking at the world. The U.S. will eventually join in something that it hasn't done up to this point, and really start to go out on the global scale of the world and start to dip its toe in the water of imperialism. And we'll get to that near the end. Now, there's some motives for imperialism. First, there was military motives. You are a country in Western Europe, say you're Britain. What you see happening around the world is as you're industrializing and making bullets and making guns and making bigger armies and boats and all those things, you're starting to look around and see your neighbors doing the same. Now, as your neighbors of Germany, France, Russia, Belgium, for example, all these different random countries are going around the world, specifically Britain, they start to realize that to be able to outlast your kind of neighbors, you need to make sure you go around the world and get what you need. Similar to that game we talked about last chapter, Risk, you need to continue to build because you don't want to be the last one with the smallest army. So that military desire for imperialism leads to many cultures basically investing tons and tons of resources into making their military stronger, bigger, with more weaponry, better weaponry, more advanced weaponry, to be able to fight for what they feel is conflicts that are basically around the corner. Politically, there's some reasons for imperialism. If you're looking at power, what's better to be able to take back to your voters? If you're a person, say, in England running for parliament, you want to be able to say that I support that Britain goes around the world and continues to grow and continues to grow its economy and continues to be successful through our army and our military. Well, you should vote for me, and this will lead to Britain being a great player on the world stage. And for many people, this is a very likable prospect for them. They want to see their country grow. Nobody wants to see the country they're living in having economic hardship, having no jobs, having a lack of funds, and basically people want to see their country succeed. The Europeans also are dealing with an economic imperialism where they're starting to run into some problems. We talked about this a little bit last chapter where they're running out of places in their Western Europe to be able to sell goods. America is starting to industrialize, and they're starting to realize they can produce a lot of goods. The French, the British, the Russians are starting to imperialize. The Germans are industrializing. And what they're realizing is that there's not a lot of people to buy the goods that they're producing. So they need to find new markets, but they also are starting to run out of raw materials to make those goods. One thing we didn't talk about a lot last chapter was the need for rubber. Many of these machines that are running now are using belts to be able to process the power that runs through those steam engines and even through those gasoline engines that are starting to come out. They need to have rubber for tires. They need to have rubber for boat caulking and for different parts. And rubber really comes from a rubber tree, which grows mostly in different parts of like tropical and subtropical regions of the globe, which Britain, Germany, France do not have at their disposal. So they have to go out into the world and retrieve those materials. At the same time, coal supplies, gasoline or oil supplies, they want to be able to get all the materials they need to still continue to produce what they want to produce whenever they want to produce it. And most of those materials are all over the globe. There's also a religious imperialism motive. What they're looking at the world and seeing is that the rest of the world does not have that Western tradition of Judeo-Christian values. And for many of them, we saw in previous chapters where the Europeans were fighting over the idea of Protestantism and Catholicism, and what they want to do in both denominations or both sections of Christianity, whether you're practicing Catholicism or Protestantism, you have a missionary mission from the Jesus of the Bible. And what they want is to be able to tell people around the globe that their religions that they've been practicing is wrong. They start to send missionaries, the Western Europeans send missionaries around the globe to be able to bring about the good news of Jesus. And as a result, this is playing to a lot of the positive vibes that people are feeling in those Western European countries, believing that they're going out and doing good things as a result of this. There's also demographic imperialism reasons. One reason is they're starting to grow with the problems of urbanization and the lack of labor lack of ability to have jobs. There's a lot of people who are starting to see a way of life that maybe is different than they've had before, specifically crime. And as a result of these people participating in crime, what they're doing is they're running out of space to house them. They're running out of jail space specifically. And a lot of these Western European nations are looking for places to unload criminals. And we'll talk about what the British end up doing later on. And dissident populations. They also are starting to run into some problems where people, specifically socialists and anarchists and communists, are saying that the world is not a playground for the Western Europeans to go around and take and carve up what they want. What they need to start doing is looking towards making society better. And if you're a person in power relying on capitalism, what you do not want is someone contradicting what you're believing or what you're kind of pushing as an ideology throughout the world. And so what you're going to do is you're going to really try and get the voters that are voting for you on your side, and it's going to make the people very happy with you as you go around the world and do the things that we talked about on this slide before. But at the same time, you're going to try and squash down any counter-protest or any kind of disagreement between you and the populations that you have as they start to really fall into the background noise as imperialism starts to take over the world. Well, first we have this idea of manifest destiny. It's originally the discovery of natural resources that lead to many Western Europeans, and you probably have heard this idea before with applied to the Western United States in the 1800s. And as they discover more natural resources, a lot of people start to look around and say, hey, these natural resources were not being used by the indigenous peoples. And as a result, this is a waste. We, good British people, know what coal looks like. And we could go there in those areas of the globe and take that coal and use it to make our empire stronger. And if they're not going to use it, then we need to go there and take it so we can be more productive. There's also an exploitation of cheap labor as these Europeans go around the globe. One of the things they're realizing is there's a lot of people who are just living their lives as peasants, more or less, in these unindustrialized areas. And they're able to kind of convince them through the early stages of capitalism, you guys need to work for us. We're going to make your lives better. We're going to bring you shirts, and we're going to bring you manufactured goods. We're going to bring you all these different things from our factories far away. In exchange, all you have to do is go and dig out, sugar cane, or grow rubber trees, or grow us food or tea or cotton, and you give us the raw materials. We'll take them back to our factories in our Western European nations, and then we'll bring you back manufactured goods through this capitalist system. There's also an expansion of markets. As the Europeans go around the globe, they start to run into people who don't have t-shirts and don't have boots and shoes and plates and metal tools. And what they're starting to say is, hey, let's be able to make those goods cheaply, and let's be able to sell them, because we've already run out of people back in our home countries that don't need as many of these goods. And so these new groups of people are basically going to help be a whole new group that's going to buy our stuff. It's limited during this time and doesn't really see a huge spike, even though it's one of the main driving factors for imperialism. There's some geopolitical considerations. Originally, these Western European peoples are looking around the globe and they're realizing that the rest of their neighbors have lots of weapons and are doing a lot of conquering of random peoples. And what they want to be able to do is put, as they look around the globe, little bases and little areas of the globe where Britain can stop and refuel, or where they can get supplies. And as a result, let's say, if we look at the history of Europe, those European nations like to fight each other. And so if you're Britain, you might be keeping an eye out on France, and you see them going into Africa. You want to go to Africa too. You don't want them to get any advantage over you. Get back to that board game of Risk we talked about before, where people do not want to be the one with the smallest army. They want to keep growing and growing. And so there's not really going to be an end in sight until about the year 1914. You want to be able to have waterways. For example, you want to be able to move as imperialism and industrialization grows. You want to be the ones that have access to different ports. You want to be the ones that have right of passage through different waters around the globe, and being able to move supplies and goods freely through the water, through boats and shipping channels, is a really important way to maintain your empire. And so you want to be able to have those waterways protected by your navy, specifically, as the Western European countries do. You want supply stations for those boats. You want people to be able to get off their boat, get more supplies like food and fresh water, and then get back on their boats. You also want to be able to have where if you have an army station nearby, they have access to goods from home and access to goods that they really want. And this really leads to imperial rivalries, that old European problems that we've been looking at, maybe 10 chapters ago, haven't really gone away. France doesn't trust Britain. Britain doesn't trust France. Britain doesn't trust Germany. Germany doesn't trust France. France doesn't trust Germany. Pick a country in Western Europe. They're really not always on the best of terms based on the history we've studied. Now, if you look at the global map of the globe, we're going to look a little bit right off the bat with England. So there's England in the little box. And so in the past we kind of talked about the Silk Road. If you wanted to be from the Roman Empire, say that boot shape, which is Italy, you would pretty much take that Silk Road through that path that red arrow just showed up if you wanted to go to India. And this is pretty much the only way you were able to trade for about a few thousand years, right? And now, at least recently, we've been talking about that. And now that Silk Road process has kind of fallen away because of some of the turmoil we've talked about through the change in the political structures through the Middle East and the change in Eastern Europe. Well, since that's gone away, the British have to start to look during the age of imperialism at going a different route. During the time we talked about before, the British were going to India through going around the Cape of Good Hope, around the bottom of Africa, and they would stop on the western coast of Africa. This was during the slavery times we started to talk about, the 1600s, right? And for them, they're starting to kind of get a little bit tired of making that trip, which was a very long trip as a result of this. So that starts to go away. And what ends up happening with England is, we talked about this last chapter, they're able to get the Suez Canal from Muhammad Ali in Egypt right after the kind of problems they were causing in the Ottoman Empire. So with the Suez Canal, you can see that this is a way better route. It's way shorter. They don't need to have as many stopping points. They're able to travel through a lot shorter distance to make it to a place that's rich in natural resources that they need. Well, as we look at why these Europeans are doing this, one of the things that starts to come up is they start to talk about this idea of the white man's burden. It's based around a poem written by Rudyard Kipling, who lived between 1864 and 1936. Rudyard Kipling was the writer of the Jungle Book, but he was also known as a very famous poet. For him, he was kind of trying to sum up this feeling that many Western Europeans had towards the rest of the world. During this time, many people saw it was their duty, it was their responsibility, it was their charge by God himself to go around the world and to try and fix the problems of the black and brown people all over the globe. For the French, for example, they called this thing not the white man's burden, but the mission civilisatrice, which means the civilizing mission. And with that implication, if you're going on a civilizing mission, the people you're running into obviously are uncivilized. So Rudyard Kipling wrote this poem. This is just the first verse of it, but it kind of sums up the attitudes towards people of the globe. So it says, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness, unfluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil, half child." In here, Rudyard Kipling is kind of arguing that it's the white man's burden to go out and send the best they have, the best engineers, the best army people, the best missionaries, the best business people, to go around the world and bind their sons to exile far away from their homelands. And they're going to serve those captive needs because that's just their responsibility and their duty that they must do. They're supposed to wait in heavy harness, like working like a plow or an oxen, on fluttered folk and on people who are just so far away and crazy, and this new caught, sullen, or sad peoples that are half devil and half child. And it was the job of these white men to go around the world and really show these others that their way was the best. The Western, quote, way was the way it ought to be. Now, there's domestic political considerations we looked at. This guy on the right-hand side is Cecil Rhodes. He argues that there's imperialism becomes an alternative to civil war. As the Western European nations are embracing capitalism and embracing the imperialism and embracing industrialization, there's starting to be some new problems within the populace. Crime, as we talked about before, but also poverty is showing up. And there are socialists and communists and anarchists and agitators just in general arguing that capitalism isn't working and we need to go to a new system. And maybe that new system is socialism, or communism, anarchism, whatever. Now, as industrialism is starting to have problems where they're running out of raw materials in many of these Western nations, they're running out of money for factory workers as wages are kind of having like a balancing effect where not a lot of people are getting paid and there's not as many raises. And that's really as a result of not having a lot of goods being sold. If you can make thousands of shirts in a factory a day, people don't need at a certain point to keep buying shirts. And you're going to run into a problem when you realize that the people in your factory are making shirts and they're doing it every day, but nobody's buying the shirts. And when there's no money coming in, you're not going to be able to pay your workers. And if you can't pay your workers, there's going to be some problems with those workers. There's some pressure from the underlying or nascent current of socialism. And these imperialist policies going around the world distract the average person from domestic policies. If you were a worker, say in Manchester, England, and you're working in a factory, you might be a little pissed off that your wages are low, but what you kind of like is that your country as overall is doing better. And as they go around the globe and you hear that Britain has kind of conquered parts of India and kind of grown its value around the globe, you're going to kind of stop to listen to the socialists and say, but it's not that bad. Yeah, maybe I'm not doing as well as I want, but the country's doing well, and that's eventually going to lead and trickle down towards me. Some people would argue that doesn't actually happen. In a lot of ways, it isn't this reason why Western Europe does as well as it does. But for this guy on the right, Cecil Rhodes, he argues that through this imperialism process, we're not going to have a civil war between the poor and the capitalists, the proletariat and the capitalists. And he really kind of sees this as a valuable way of making the world a better place, even though he was kind of like crazy racist. Next, technology and imperialism. The transportation. The reason they're able to be more successful through this process is 100% due to the industrialization process. Up until this point, the Europeans had a hard time really breaking into sections of Africa and sections of Central Asia. One of the main reasons was transportation. You need to be able in Africa to penetrate the inner parts of Africa is the ability to go upriver. Now, if you have a boat pretty much rowed by hand, it's very, very difficult to move goods and supplies upriver. Through the invention of steamships, they're able to get larger ships up the river into Central Africa, as a lot of rivers that are in Central Africa run out towards the coast. With these steamships, they're able to move goods, troops, and be more successful at penetrating the inner parts of Africa, which many European countries had not been able to do through the sea routes. In addition to the steamships, they're also using steam engines on railroads. This railroad system that's built all over Africa after the initial invasion, if you would call it, for the scramble for Africa, allows Europeans to move goods from the coast by unloading it from large ships on the coast onto train tracks in the railroads and then moving them into interior holdings in centralized Africa or in the central part of India. They also set up an infrastructure through this process. There is telephone lines, there are telegraph lines, there are railroads, there is water places for them to get clean water. There are supply stops, there are roads that are built, and through this process, that infrastructure allows for the exploration and deeper penetration of the African and Indian continent, for example, for the British. In addition to that, they build the Suez Canal, which we talked about before, and the Panama Canal by the Americans later on, which we'll come back to. One of the biggest advantages to taking over most of Africa was the weaponry. Up to this point, many people had muzzle-loading muskets. That's the one where you have your gun. It's a very long gun. You bite like a little paper wadded thing with a bullet in it that's round. You bite off that part. You pour the powder from that paper thing inside of there. You spit the bullet out and you put it into the end of your gun. You punch it down with this long rod on the bottom of your gun. You pull the rod out. You put the rod back. You aim your gun. You click back the little hammer thing by the trigger, and then you pull the trigger and it goes boom and it fires. Could take a good 15 seconds. Really good people could do it in less time. But by the mid-century, we're starting to have breech-loading rifles. And what that means is weaponry is now moving towards cartridges, where it looks like a modern bullet you would think of today. On the very end is the actual projectile that leaves the gun. And then inside of this, just below it, there's this metal-like shell. And inside of there is some powder with a little tiny dot on the end of that the casing, that's able to create a spark, which then hits the powder, which then fires with pressure the bullet out the front. This is able to do a number of things. It makes the ability to fire faster because you can load multiple rounds into a gun. You're also able to keep the temperatures of those bullets more or less successful. The problem up to that point with muzzle-loading muskets was if it ever got wet, or it got too humid, or it got too dry, or it got to anything other than perfect, guns sometimes would misfire, or not fire, or explode. And at this point, they had moved away from round bullets to kind of that cone shape, which allows it to spin and go faster and farther at higher rates. Through this process, they're able to reduce loading time. And by the 1880s, a guy named Hiram Maxim invents the Maxim machine gun, which is kind of pictured here on the left, one of the early models. It's a gun that basically uses a belt with those cartridges on them that feeds automatically the bullets out of the gun by just basically pulling or pushing a button or pulling a lever. The Maxim machine gun is able to fire 11 rounds per second. That's boom, 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 boom in 1 second. So if you compare it to my example before, where it was, bite the bullet, pour the powder in, spit out the bullet, put the bullet, do that whole thing, you could have fired, maybe 100 bullets in the time that it would take for one person to reload. So this is a huge technological advantage in terms of weaponry. It's able to reduce the amount of danger for invading armies, specifically in India and Africa, and most of the world we're going to look at through this time. And because the Western Europeans basically are the only ones with this technological advantage, they're able to do what they please where they want around the globe. The military advantage, for example, here's a good example, the Battle of Omdurman near Khartoum on the Nile in 1898. There was 5 hours of fighting, and on one side was the British with 6 gunboats, which had 21 machine guns facing outward. The British force lost a few hundred men, but during that exact same 5 hours of fighting, thousands of Sudanese are killed as a result. This is amazing for the military advantage that it poses towards people from Western Europe. Up to this point, it was about sheer numbers. If you went to, say, the Sudan and you brought a small army, you're not going to commit lots of troops to what might actually be a tactical defeat. What you want to do is be able to try and match army for army, but many people didn't want to do that because it would cost too many lives. With this new military advantage, you don't need to have lots of men to fight off thousands of men. And this is all in response to basically that ability to have a faster firing gun. Communications get better. For example, correspondence of information. In the 1830s, from Britain to India, it could take 2 years. So you could have a sister who lives in India and you live in Manchester or London, and you write her saying that your baby has been born on Sunday and you'd love for her to come see her. Well, 2 years later, when that kid is 2, she might get the letter saying that your kid was born. After the invention of, or the creation of the Suez Canal, that only takes about 2 weeks for information to go from the heart of England to Calcutta. By this process, they also introduced the telegraphs. It's that beep thing where they tap on and they kind of send signals out through Morse code. In the 1870s, it's the development of submarine cables, literal underwater cables, and this is able to increase the amount of speed that information travels. And so from Britain to India, it only takes 5 hours for information to travel that far, which up to that point only 40 years earlier, it took 2 years. The British Empire in India. Well, now we've looked at a few different trading companies, and now we're going to add another one called the British East India Company. This group had a monopoly on trade. One of their biggest things was that if you think about these trading companies, they're kind of like countries within a country. The British government really sanctioned a lot of what they did, but they didn't really have a direct influence on what they did. They had a board, similar to today's modern companies having a board of executives. And these board of executives invested money and found investors to do trading around the globe. Well, the British East India Company really works to be able to try and get investment and get goods from India back to England and back and forth to be able to make money. This goes back to our idea of mercantilism from a few chapters ago. And by having a monopoly or a single access for their company alone from Britain or England to India, they're able to make lots of cash because they're the sole group that's able to move the goods from there and back and forth. Originally, they get permission from the Mughal emperors that we talked about a few chapters before, and this company is able to gain lots of investors and lots of money. And when I say they were a country kind of within a country, what I mean is they had their own army. They were able to negotiate contracts without the need for British representation. Their company pretty much just did what they wanted when they wanted. The British government was happy because they didn't have to commit troops to protect those goods, and they also got taxes as a result of it. And their empire was growing as they had just more boats going around the world collecting goods. And the British East India Company really benefited because they got to make lots of money, and they really didn't have to go back home and worry about getting voted or having their missions cut short because the populace at home decided they don't like the war that's going on. So this company makes a lot of money as a result of just trading. The Mughal Empire declines after the death of Aurangzeb, and really there's no one to check them anymore. They have these old contracts, they have these old agreements with the Mughals, but nobody really is around to ensure that nothing sketchy is going on. And the British East India Company decides that they're going to kind of take advantage of this vacuum of power. Well, the British start to look around the actual country of England with their larger commonwealth known as the British. They look around and they say, India doesn't really seem to have a lot of leaders. After the death of Aurangzeb, they start to see that the Mughals aren't really a unified group, as we saw on the map from before. And they start to see that they're making lots of money and they're able to get lots of goods back to England from the British East India Company. And they start to say that maybe we need to have a protection of those economic resources through political conquest. So what we're going to do is we're going to convince a lot of the Indian people and a lot of the areas of India to really just allow us to be in charge. There's no one really in charge there, and some of those like smaller regional leaders, they don't have guns, especially the guns that we have. And if we show up and we're really willing to do a number of things that are a little different than what they're doing in India, maybe the people will like us. So, for example, one of the first things they do is they sign agreements with the small regional leaders called the Doctrine of Lapse. What they would do is, let's say you were a Mughal great-great-great-great-grandson of like Aurangzeb, and you start to look around and you're like, I'm living a pretty good life. My region isn't very big. And then one day a British envoy comes and says, hey, we have a quick idea. We're willing to give you some money. We're willing to give you some prestige, some privileges in the British Empire. All you have to do is sign this paper that says, if you don't have any male heirs, the British government gets control of your land. You can live it up right now. You can live in your palace. We're not going to change anything. We just want to be able to trade in your area, and sign this contract. And if you were somebody who saw, well, it's not really going to affect me and I'll be dead by that point, so you signed the agreement. Well, let's say a generation later, your son doesn't have any boys. Well, that land all now goes and defaults immediately to the British. They more than likely would let you just stay on the land, but you would no longer be in charge of that area. The British also are able to have this kind of ingenious way of making a new set of people that they're able to rule over the Indian people with. The British are sent as kind of army infantrymen and officers to be able to rule over Indian troops who would all be like lower level troops. These were known as sepoys. And the sepoys oftentimes came from outcasted groups. If we go back to the caste system, the British were really smart in saying, hey, you outcasted person, we don't really care about this caste system that you guys have been doing for a while. What we really want is you to be able to stick up for us if ever there's anything going wrong. There is very few of us British here, and there's a lot of you Indians. And so we're willing to give you a gun, a uniform, money from our empire. And as a result, all you have to do is if we tell you you have to shoot people or we tell you have to go fight people, you got to fight people. And we will treat you just like any other soldier in the British Empire. If you were an Indian person living at that time and you were somebody who was a person who was from the outcasted system, you might say, that's awesome. I want to be able to switch out and do that instead of having, deal with dead bodies all the time. So this works amazingly well for the British in their conquest of India. Except for in 1857 when there was a revolt with the sepoys. They give out newly issued rifles, and in those rifles there were cartridges that had bullets to go inside of them, but they had wax paper. And the way to protect the cartridges is they used to wax it so they wouldn't rust or have any water get in them if they fell in the ocean or had sea salt from the air. But they greased it with animal fat. So for those Hindu sepoys, the problem was the beef. They were using beef fat to basically protect the bullets, and Hindus, that's a very sacred animal, and it disrespects their culture and their religion. For Muslims, some of the fat was pork fat, and pork is a very unclean animal in Islam. A small-scale rebellion sets up a general anti-British revolt. A lot of these sepoys start getting pissed about what's happening with this animal fat thing, but eventually more Indians join in saying, well, we're really getting tired of how the British are taking advantage of the Indian people. Well, the British gained the upper hand in 1857 and pretty much quashed the rebellion, instituting some new policies. The British Imperial rule. In response to the rebellion, Britain does a couple things. Number one, they get rid of the Mughal Empire. No longer are they going to allow any of those Mughal rulers to have any power, and they basically shut down all of India's Mughal rulers from having any power in the area. They take the emperor of the Mughal Empire at that time, and they send him off to Burma, which is Myanmar. They abolish the East India Company and say no longer can there be an East India Company. Instead, we are just going to make the British Empire the sole trading partner of India. And they established direct rule of India by the British government. Up to this point, the Mughal rulers were basically not puppets, but willing participants in the British rule of India. They were given money and resources as long as they did what the British said. But after the abolishment of the Mughal Empire, the British actually sent British overseers, British government officials, British parliamentary officials appointed by people back in England to oversee the entire country of India. So you'd have to imagine that many Indians would see this and say, so not only now have all our leaders been kicked out, but now they are being forced to listen to these random white guys that got off boats only a couple days ago, and now they're in charge of our whole country. So it starts to cause some anger within the Indian people. Well, in British-ruled India, they start to organize the agriculture. What they start to tell the people is, we don't want you to grow as much wheat, not as much rice. We want you to focus on a couple things. We want you to focus on 3 goods. Growing tea, which we can sell around the world and take back home to make it cheaper. We want you to sell coffee, which we don't drink a lot of, but we'll sell around the globe. And finally, opium, which we talked about last chapter, which will be sent to China so they can start to open up trade in China. The stamp of British culture and on the Indian environment is the introduction of British practices like speaking English in India, the introduction of British systems of capitalism, British systems of drinking tea in the afternoon for a number of people in India. That's still something that is just kind of part of the Indian culture. Next, we're going to do imperialism in Central Asia. The British, the French, and Russians compete for Central Asia. France starts out competing, but they drop out after Napoleon has his problems. Russia is active in the 1860s at Tashkent, Bokhara, and Samarkand, and approached India. They start to call this area right around Afghanistan the Great Game. It's where the Russian and British basically have spy spies and fighting and lots of negotiations in back rooms with tribal leaders in Afghanistan. And the idea was the Russians wanted to expand out. Remember that whole Western facing, wanting to be a part of the game that the Western Europeans didn't want them to play? And the British are trying to expand their empire into the Middle East when they've already kind of done that with the Ottoman Empire. They're setting up an imperialist war. They're starting to look around and realize that, well, yes, they're basically competing for resources in Afghanistan. Really, the British and the Russians are keeping an eye on one another, and Afghanistan's kind of the pawn in the middle getting played back and forth. The Russian Revolution of 1917 stops this war from really breaking out for a time. In Southeast Asia, the Spanish take over the Philippines, the Dutch take over Indonesia, making it the Dutch East Indies, the British establish a presence from the 1820s, and there's a conflict with kings of Burma, which is Myanmar, in the 1820s, established colonial authority by the 1880s. Thomas Stamford Raffles found Singapore for trade in the Strait of Malacca. It's basically a big trading spot for people. It's the base of British colonization in Malaysia from the 1870s and 80s, and the French take over Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, 1859 to 1893, and kind of encourage a conversion to Christianity, specifically Catholicism. Now, if you think back to our map, the whole of pretty much Southeast Asia has been carved up. China, India, a lot of the islands we were looking at before have been taken over by lots of different Western European nations, and there isn't really any end in sight if you're one of those people. You don't really see how you're going to get out of what's been happening. So we're going to pause here on this section, and we're going to move over to another area of the globe. Africa. At the same time all this is happening, the Western Europeans are also competing for large sections of Africa. Africa had been pretty much untouched in the inner parts of Africa to this point because of the things we talked about before with the technology. But now we're starting to see some change as a result of that technology, and these Western Europeans are going to start to carve up some of the deeper and more inner parts of Africa. This is known as the Scramble for Africa from 1875 to 1900. The French, the Portuguese, the Belgians, and English are all competing for the, quote, dark continent. Now, for the rest of this section, there's going to be some kind of feeling that this is kind of racist. I'm just going to kind of describe it in the way they would have looked at it, so you can kind of get a picture of how these Western Europeans were thinking about the globe at the time. The reason they called it the Dark Continent was for a couple of reasons. Number one, they called it the Dark Continent because they had no idea what was in the center of the continent. Many people many Western Europeans had never been that far inland because of the technological limitations, and because the last time the Europeans were there pretty much was for the slave trade, and the slave trade worked super efficiently to just make the tribes capture slaves from other tribes and bring them to the coast. They called it the Dark Continent also because they felt it was a dark and mysterious land without Christianity, which was not true, Ethiopia being one of the oldest Christian regions. They also thought that it was dark for its lack of enlightenment. Remember, the Enlightenment had happened, and many of those Western ideals had spread throughout Western Europe and most of the globe in the Western world, while Africa, they thought, had no idea about Rousseau and Locke and the French Revolution and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and all the founding fathers in America and their ideas of freedom, democracy, and republic. Even though many Africans probably would have been familiar with the concepts, they saw them as being uncivilized through that process. And finally, they thought of it in a very racist way of the dark continent full of black people. And this attitude that the British had towards Africa, and basically most of the Western Europeans had toward Africa, really colored how they looked at the globe and looked at how they were going to treat these people that they encountered. Britain establishes a strong presence in Egypt and Rhodesia, which is named after Cecil Rhodes, and they set up the Suez Canal, and in Rhodesia they just so happened to find a bunch of gold and a bunch of diamonds. All right, so next we have the rewriting of African history. We talked a little bit about Greater Zimbabwe and some of the things that had happened in Africa up to this point. They had some civilizations that were doing pretty well. They had some areas of Africa that were pretty advanced for their time periods, depending on the time period we're talking about. Really, what ends up happening to Africa is kind of a tragic story of the advancement of technology from those Western European countries. As they go into Africa, they're able to kind of rewrite some of the way that Africans looked at history, and also how many historians looked at history up to this even present day. Ancient Africa was doing pretty well, and originally it was having some implication for imperialist rule. The European exploration of these rivers like the Nile, the Niger, the Congo, and the Zambezi River gives them more information on the interior of Africa. And some of the things they would do, for example, is as they went around, they would run into things like Greater Zimbabwe, or they would run into civilizations that had been around for a while. And they said, well, part of the problem that these European countries were having was there was no way in their minds, when you think back to that dark continent comment, for them, they said there's no way that these Africans built these great monuments, they built these statues. There must have been some European influence here before even the Africans got here. And so we've studied history all the way back to basically the first humans walking upright. We know that a lot of our human ancestry comes from Eastern Africa. And for many people in Western Europe at the time, they said there's got to be a better explanation for why all this stuff is here. And what it must have been is way, way back in the lost record of history, there must have been some Europeans, and they were there, and they built stuff, and then they left for a while. And when they left all their stuff behind, but the Africans that eventually would migrate into that area in Africa took it over and claimed it as their own. Now, with this justification, what they start to say is, well, if it was the European peoples before, then it must be ours to claim now. So as they start to go around, what they start to see is there's no need for Africans to really claim anything that's their own. It's really European stuff, and so since it's European stuff, we might as well just take it back. For example, King Leopold II of Belgium, he starts the Congo Free State, and he sets up commercial ventures. Now, King Leopold does something a little different than the other European leaders at this time. King Leopold is the king of Belgium, but he also is a person, like an individual. And part of his individual power as an individual person, he selects people to go into Africa and basically make treaties with the people of the Congo and the tribes. And he says that we're going to set up some commercial businesses to collect like rubber trees and some other goods that are in the area, like mining rights to the area. And it's going to personally benefit the King Leopold II. It's not going to trickle down into the Belgian government, the money for those for that country. What it's really going to do is enrich King Leopold himself. Eventually, he takes control of the colony in 1908 and renames it the Belgian Congo, when in reality he's just making money for himself. We then get to South Africa. The very bottom part of Africa is known as South Africa. In the South African or Boer War of 1899 to 1902. The Dutch East India Company establishes in Cape Town in 1652, and eventually they tell a bunch of farmers or Boers to follow and settle into the territory. Later they're going to be known as Afrikaners. Africans are people who live in Africa. They're the black-skinned people who live there for a while. The Afrikaners are those farmers that end up being Dutch settlers who move there from Europe. There's some competition and conflict with these indigenous people, specifically the Khoikhoi and the Xhosa peoples. The X is supposedly silent. Now, what ends up happening is because the Dutch East India Company's there with their guns and they're trading post-empire, one of the things they're able to do is enforce laws on behalf of the other Europeans who have shown up. Those Boers start to take over land, and they go up to the natives and say, hey, we know you live here, but we kind of bought it from the Dutch East India Company, and we want you to leave. And so there's some conflict because the natives are saying, well, we've lived here and no one told us, and we don't really see that you have a right to this land. So they start to have some violence break out over this conflict. Well, the British eventually take over in 1806, and slavery is a major issue of conflict. The Afrikaners migrate eastward on the Great Trek and overpower the Ndebele and Zulu resistance with superior firepower. At this point, those Europeans are able to use the weapons that they've accumulated through technological advancement to basically overtake these very ferocious warrior tribes, specifically the Ndebele and the Zulus. And they set up their own little republics in the area of South Africa. The British are fine with these random people, these Afrikaners being there. It's now a mix of Dutch and British settlers. They're fine with them farming there, and they're kind of like whatever until gold is discovered there. And the British say, time out, we need to get down there, we need to get all that gold. There's some white-on-white conflict as many of the Europeans start to fight over resources, but there's also black soldiers and laborers mixed in who are starting to say, we want to support one side, but maybe not the other side, and we don't really know who's really going to win this, so we're going to have some issues going back and forth. The Afrikaners eventually concede in 1902, and in 1910 are integrated into the Union of South Africa. We're then going to move on to this section called the Berlin West Africa Conference. It's the Berlin Conference. It's 1884 to 1885. 14 European states and the United States show up. they have this meeting, and what they say in Berlin is this: Africa has become kind of a sore spot for most of Europe. It's leading to conflict, it's leading to violence outside of Europe between Europeans. And what they want to do is create a place where they can sit down and say, all right, we're going to negotiate how we're going to take over Africa. None of the African states were invited to be a part of this conversation in Berlin. So basically, the European nations set up their own rules. And one of the rules of colonization is any European state can take unoccupied territory after informing the other European powers. So basically what you would do is you take over an area and you maybe write it down and say, okay, we've mapped out this area. We know from this riverbank to this canyon, 6 miles by 7 miles, squared. This is now going to be property of the German Empire, for example. And all the Europeans had to do was go there, recognize that no one was there, and by no one unoccupied, they meant no white settlers were there. And the Germans in this example would just notify the other nations that this is their area, and the Europeans would say, okay, that's fine. European firepower dominates Africa because as they went around, they didn't really find unoccupied territory. They found tribes of Africans living there, and they were able to basically come into conflict with them through violence, and eventually the Europeans win. There are some exceptions. One is Ethiopia fights off Italy in 1896 through just some tactical advantages they have. And Liberia, eventually in the western kind of curved part of Africa, ends up being a dependency of the U.S. After the freedom of slaves from America, many Africans, you'll learn about this in U.S. history, had a move called the Back to Africa movement, and many of them wanted to resettle in Africa based on kind of a belief that America would never accept the former slaves, and so they needed to go back to Africa to start a life anew there. And Liberia today is kind of a very sad country full of many problems to this day. Systems of colonial rule. There's concessionary companies, which are basically private companies, get large tracts of land to exploit natural resources. So you're France, and you have dominated an area of, let's say, Algeria. What you're going to do is you're going to say, we don't really want to go there. So what we want to do is make money, though. And so we're willing to offer contracts to companies that want to invest in our area that we're going to kind of control. And you guys are going to get the resources, and you're going to pay taxes on those resources. And we're going to protect you if anybody messes with you, especially the European nations. But it's pretty much you guys being investors going and getting all those supplies. The companies get freedom to tax and recruit labor in those areas. So when they land there, many of those private companies show up and go to the tribes and say, hey, we own this area, even though you live here, and you guys need to pay us some taxes. And also you need to work in the mines or work in harvesting rubber trees. And this leads to horrible abuses for the native peoples. Because of that technological advancement, native peoples aren't really able to fight back. There's a profit margin, which is basically how much money you make on an investment. Let's say you invest $100 and you make back through your investment $105. Your profit margin is $5. The profit margin is minimal, so they're not making a ton of money, but it works out in favor of those European countries because they're still getting the taxes that they want from those private companies. They don't really have to do anything like send troops there most of the time, and they really can wash their hands of the whole situation and say, we don't know anything about what's going on, and we're fine with whatever's going on there as long as they keep paying their taxes. There's one exception, which is France. They are on a civilizing mission. They see the whole of Africa as being an uncivilized area. After the Enlightenment, they see the French Revolution, they kind of see what their influence has wrought around the globe, and they say what we need to do is take all the awesome ideas of liberté, égalité, fraternité around the world, and especially to Africa. And so we're going to go help those poor Africans. There's a chronic shortage of European personnel. The language and cultural barriers are set up. In French West Africa, for example, there's 3,600 Europeans that rule 9 million Africans. Because there wasn't a lot of European personnel there, causes some problems, but they're able to do it, take over that area and control that area through the use of firepower and weaponry. There are language barriers because the French basically tell the Africans they're no longer supposed to speak their native tongue. They're really going to teach them the French way of doing everything. French law, French education, French philosophy, French language, French everything. And that's what those people are going to practice and do because they think that their culture, the African culture, is not very good. It's kind of just backwards and uncivilized. And as the French go in to civilize, they have specifically sent French people to civilize the Africans through this process. Indirect rule is what most European countries opt for, however. Frederick de Lugard, he's a British person from 1858 to 1945. He writes this kind of pamphlet-y journal speech thing. It's called the dual mandate in British tropical Africa. Basically, here's what he says. It's too complicated for British people to go there and control such a large area with such few Europeans without risk losing lots of manpower, without risking lots of the money of the British Empire. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to set up indigenous institutions to be like operating on our behalf. So the British people would go to like different tribal leaders and say, hi, we're from Britain. It's a really far away island. Here's what we need you to do. You're the leader of this tribe. You guys are going to be in charge. We're going to keep you in charge. But we kind of own this area. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give you resources. We're going to give you like manufactured goods. We're going to give you some money. And we're going to let you be a part of our empire. And you're going to get some benefits of that. But in exchange, you leaders of tribes have to tell your people to go and harvest things we tell you to get. So for example, let's say your tribe, and you're the leader, your tribe has lots of rubber trees in their area. The British representative would come and say, hey, you need to get your people to go harvest those trees, bring them here. We'll send a train around and they'll pick up all those goods. In exchange, we'll drop off a bunch of stuff. It'll enrich you and your family. And it works out a lot better because the natives are more willing to listen to their leader because of already built-in institutions. And it really works out to not have to waste any resources on behalf of the Western Europeans who still get what they want without a lot of conflict. There is some, however, difficulty in establishing tribal categories. Many Europeans kind of show up and don't understand traditional tribal boundaries or regions or language or tribal units, and they kind of just lump people together and they say, okay, you're tribe A and you're tribe B, you guys are going to work together. When in the past, for maybe 100 years or 300 years, tribe A and B have been fighting and warring and have basically had conflict. And sometimes the British would arbitrarily pick tribe A, for example, to be in charge of tribe B. And tribe A, after those centuries of being at war, end up abusing that power and hurting tribe B. And they impose arbitrary boundaries. Sometimes they would make whole new sections that they controlled and lump together tribes that really didn't get along. And by doing that, it leads to conflict. And the only reason it doesn't spiral out of control is because the British, for example, or the Germans show up and say, you guys can't fight. You have to go get our supplies and bring them here. But when the colonizing Europeans leave eventually, this is going to lead to large-scale conflict between tribes. Now we're going to move on to Oceania. Around 1914, we have Micronesia, we have the Dutch, the British, the French, and the US all around with some German people running in there, and there's the Southern Pacific and the North Pacific islands. European imperialism in Australia and New Zealand. The English use Australia as a penal colony or a prison colony from 1788. There's been this idea that bounces around every now and then that people say, we should take all the bad people and instead of putting them in prison, we should just build this big compound like the middle of the desert, for example, or on an island. And let's just drop all those guys off and we'll give them tools, we'll give them supplies for building like wells and for building like farms, and we'll just give them some basic stuff and we'll be like, all right, here you guys go. We'll come and get you in about 20 years when you've served your sentence, but take care of yourselves. If you don't want to farm, you're going to die. So good luck. Australia is used for that. Once the British discover Australia as a big island, they basically say, hey, go drop those criminals that have been having all this time stabbing people and hurting people in England, and let's go and just drop them off far away, and that'll help England out because we don't have to deal with the poor people and we don't have to spend taxes on them, and we also get rid of just kind of the negative elements. So it's a win-win for politicians. It's a win-win for many people who see this as a benefit for people that are being disrupted to society back in England. And many of the penal people or the prisoners that are dropped off, they see it as kind of like I guess we're stuck here now. Voluntary migrants eventually follow, and eventually in 1851, gold is discovered and the British show up and say, time out, need to go get that stuff. Hey, there's this one weird thing that happens. When they get there, they run into some natives. And some of the things that are problematic with running into natives from Europe is similar to what happened during the Columbian Exchange. This is one of those, connections that we want to keep looking for in AP World History. Smallpox and measles kill off a large population of the natives. Not very good, not very positive. Territory is eventually called terra nullius, which Latin means the land belonging to no one. Again, back to those attitudes of Western Europeans saying that this doesn't really have anyone living there, and those natives aren't really people to them, so I guess we can take it over. In New Zealand, the natives are forced to sign a Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, placing New Zealand under the British protection. The British see it as like, well, you guys need our protection in case anyone wants to show up and take over your land, so we're going to claim you as the British Empire in case the Germans or the French or the Dutch ever show up. European and native population in Australia and New Zealand, if you look on the left, around 1800, there was 850,000 natives to 5,000 Europeans, but by 1900 there's only 135,000 natives to 4,500,000 Europeans. So because of the diseases that end up being imported there from the European mainland, the island natives of Australia and New Zealand are pretty much destroyed as a result of it, similar in a lot of ways to what happened during the Columbian Exchange. European imperialism in the Pacific Islands, there are commercial outposts. Whalers are seeking ports. The South Pacific and the North Pacific have lots of whales in them, and many Europeans were looking for whales for their fat, their blubber, that's used in lanterns during this time, and also looking for just kind of fishing kind of things in that area. Merchants specifically are seeking sandalwood and sea slugs, and they want to take that back to China. And there's also missionaries seeking souls. So back to that whole thing a few chapters ago with God, Gold, and Glory. This is still kind of in the background of many people's minds from Europe. The British, the French, the German, and American powers carve up all those Pacific islands. For example, we looked at that map. There's whole areas of that part of the globe where basically everybody shows up and says, all right, this is part of our empire now, and many of the natives don't really have the power to fight back because of the technology, and also are kind of caught off guard when many of them had been living similar lifestyles to what they had been living for a few thousand years, and now they're being faced with machine guns. Tonga, however, remains independent, but relies on Britain for goods and protection. The U.S. is going to join in now. President James Monroe warns Europeans not to engage imperialism in the Western Hemisphere in 1823. So if we go back and rewind a little bit back to George Washington, one of the last things he talks about in his farewell address is the idea that we need to be friends with everybody and not really get entangled in international conflicts. George Washington sees a future where Europe has pretty much, if you look at our history, that we've been studying, they just keep fighting each other. They hate each other, and they don't want to work together on anything. And George Washington says, we're a whole ocean away. We need to stop being involved in European conflicts. So if the Europeans end up fighting each other, like the French want to fight the British again, whatever. The British want to fight the Germans, whatever. That's not our problem because we live a whole ocean away. Well, James Monroe in 1823 says to Europeans, hey, we need you guys not to come over to the Western Hemisphere, like North and South America, because we're not going to tolerate if you guys start doing that imperialism thing you're doing in Africa and Southeast Asia and Asia. And they set up what's called the Monroe Doctrine. And under James Monroe, America pledges that all of the Americas are a U.S. protectorate. If anybody comes to try and take over sections of, say, South America from Europe, we are going to stop them. In 1867, we eventually purchased Alaska from Russia. It has some resources there that we see as valuable. In 1875, we establish a protectorate over Hawaii. The locals overthrow their queen in 1893 and persuade the U.S. to acquire the islands in 1898. Then we get to the Spanish-Cuban-American War. The U.S. declares war in Spain after the battleship Maine is sunk in the Havana harbor. I don't really want to go too deep into it. You can look at it in U.S. history. Basically, the boat sinks. There's some reasons people say why it sunk, but it sinks. This leads people in America to kind of say, hey, we need to get out there, and these people that are living in Cuba, they're messing with the U.S., and nobody messes with the U.S., so what we need to do is go down there and fight them. And the U.S. eventually wins and takes possession of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. And the U.S. intervenes in other Caribbean and Central American lands. We occupy the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Haiti. Eventually, the Filipinos revolt against Spanish rule and later against U.S. rule. So if you look at this, it's not that America really wanted necessarily to get involved in the whole imperialism system, but what they do see is that the countries of Europe are getting enriched through this process for natural resources and labor and markets. What they want is to just be kind of part of the game. Going back to my board game, the Risk board game example, these people are in America looking around saying, we don't want to be the country with the smallest army by the end. We then get to the Panama Canal. Eventually, President Theodore Roosevelt, who's in office from 1901 to 1909, supports the insurrection against Colombia. Basically, people living in Colombia don't really like what's going on in Colombia, and President Theodore Roosevelt says, hey, Colombians that don't like the Colombian government, we're willing to support you as you try and overthrow Colombia, and what we really want is to be able to give you goods and supplies and weapons to be able to fight back. Well, those rebels eventually win, and they set up a state called Panama. And the U.S. comes back and says, hey, remember when we supported you? And the rebels say, yeah, that was great. It was wonderful. What we need to do now is we're the U.S., and since we helped you, we're not going to ask for much. We just want a section of Panama, probably the thinnest part. And what we want to do is we want to destroy the land. And we want to build this thing called a canal. And the U.S. wants to build this canal. We're going to call it the Panama Canal Zone. And we're going to pretty much have exclusive rights over it to use it. And what we're going to do is move our boats from there. So if you think about the United States as being East Coast, West Coast with that, Florida, California, all that stuff. If you were in New York Harbor with your big battleship and you're in the U.S., it would take, a very long time to get that battleship from New York Harbor to Los Angeles Harbor if anyone in the Pacific decided to try and invade or attack the United States on the West Coast. But with the Panama Canal, we no longer have to go all the way south to almost Antarctica around the very bottom tip of South America. We just move all the way through the Panama Canal, which shortens the trip considerably, just like the Suez Canal in Egypt, to make our ability to protect both coasts a lot easier in the United States. Roosevelt eventually makes this thing called the Roosevelt Corollary of the Monroe Doctrine. And it basically says the U.S. has the right to intervene in domestic affairs of other nations if the U.S. investments are threatened. So as U.S. Companies are starting to look at South America, they're saying, maybe we need to set up some companies just like the Europeans are doing in Africa and in Asia. What we want to do is send, some people to go down there and get some rubber or get some oil that's starting to come around with the invention of like better engines, no longer relying on steam, and also like food like bananas and pineapples and sugar. And the U.S. says if anything is going to cause the U.S. to not be successful, specifically with those businesses that were kind of American businesses in South America, we have the right to show up and just shut down whoever's causing problems for the United States in those countries. Then we get to early Japanese expansion. There's resentment over unequal treaties of the 1860s. We looked a little bit last chapter about the transition from the shogunate to the Meiji Restoration with the emperor. In the 1870s, there's colonized northern region, Hokkaido, Kuriil Islands, southern Okinawa, Ryukyu Islands as well. 1876, the Japanese purchased warships from Britain and dominate Korea. The Japanese have been learning and watching what's happening around the world. Similar to last chapter, what they saw was industrialization was leading the Europeans to be more successful through their use of technology. The Japanese are willing to work with the British and say, can we buy some boats? We're willing to still keep doing the trading thing, but we want to be players on the world stage. Britain says that's fine as long as they, are willing to not mess with their stuff. So they eventually go over and take over the Korean Peninsula. There eventually is a Sino-Japanese war. Sino means Chinese. It's just what it is. Over Korea results in a Japanese victory because, again, of the lack of resources and power that China is facing during this time because of the carving up of China through imperialism, and the technological advantage that Japan has through the Meiji Restoration and investment in technology from Western Europe. Eventually we get to the Russo-Japanese War, which we talked about last chapter, and the Japanese win as well because of their investment in technology that they're receiving from Western European nations. I made this slide red because it's kind of like the long-term big kind of takeaway thing that you need for this chapter. The colonized states encouraged to exploit natural resources rather than build manufacturing centers. If you're a country like Britain, one of the things you don't really care a lot about is the native peoples. What you see is a large empire. While you might care enough to keep the population of your colonized areas happy, you don't really want to make them self-sufficient, because self-sufficiency means they don't need you and means that they could eventually overthrow you and keep running their country with all their resources that they have, and they could make themselves benefit from the resources they're owning. So if you're Britain, what you might do is you would say, okay, we're going to go there, we're going to take their stuff, but we're going to keep them dependent on us for those manufactured goods. Now that we've got the people of our colonized areas hooked on, clothing from Manchester, for example, in Britain, or from different types of resources through our large empire network of trade, we want to make sure that all we do is when we show up to India, for example, we unload our manufactured goods from England, we load up our boats with the raw materials like cotton or jute, which is used for different processes in manufacturing. They load up tea so they can go sell it, and then they'll constantly keep this process going so that way those individual places like India, for example, will not ever see a need to get rid of the imperialist powers. The encouraged dependency on imperial power for manufacturers goods made from native raw product, like for example with Indian cotton. In India, for many, many years, Indians took cotton, spun it, made clothing. The problem then becomes that the British show up and say, hey, we know you guys can make clothing, but we can make it so much faster, so much cheaper, so much better. So why don't we just do this? You guys give us cotton, in exchange we'll give you money, and then you can buy the goods from us that we take back to India from like Manchester, for example, in England. The Indians see this as kind of a benefit for a time, but really what they're giving up is their ability to take care of themselves, their ability to be able to not need the imperial powers coming in and bringing them stuff. because there's such a high priority placed on growing cotton, there's less and less a priority placed on growing individual food for their countries. So a lot of times Britain would even show up with food from other areas of the globe and drop that off to make sure that the Indians were eating. This dependency, it really leads to a kind of entrenchment in the idea that India cannot survive without the British showing up and bringing the goods or the food. They also introduce new crops. For example, there's tea in Ceylon. They start growing tea all over there. Imperialism and migration during the 19th and early century. If you just look at all these arrows, look at where everybody goes. Everybody from around the globe kind of shifts around. They start moving for a number of reasons. We'll kind of break it down in the next slides. First is labor migration. Europeans move to temperate lands or more moderate lands, less cold, less hot. They work as free cultivators, basically independent farmers and industrial laborers in factories. 32 million moved to the U.S. between 1800 and 1914 for a number of reasons. The Irish, for example, move to America as a result of the potato famine. Other European countries move out because of internal conflicts. Some are kicked out. Some basically just make it to the U.S. because they see it as a land kind of not engaging in the imperialism system. Maybe for a lot of these people, they're seeing that their class or social status is kind of stuck where they are, and being able to move to America, they can have a new start with more land. Africans, Asians, and Pacific Islanders move to tropical, subtropical lands, and they eventually become indentured laborers, which is just slavery but based on debt, and manual laborers working in the farms and production of iron and stuff like that. 2.5 million move between 1820 and 1914. Eventually we get to colonial conflicts. Thousands of insurrections are against colonial rule. The Tanayaka Maji Rebellion against the Germans, I'm only going to call them the Maji from here on out, is one of the more famous ones. There was a tribe that really believed in their shaman and some of their traditional religious beliefs. Now, the Germans had taken over this area, and their shaman had told this tribe that they had this special water or magic water called Maji. And they told the rebels, the shamans did, that if they sprinkled themselves with this blessed or holy Maji water, it would be protection against these modern machine gun weapons. Basically, the bullets would hit them, and if they believed hard enough, that the bullets would turn into steam and that it wouldn't hurt them. So this works for a number of reasons. If you are a person promoting a religion, specifically a shamanistic style religion that relies on faith, what you have to say is put this on, this magic water, and if you get shot, well, obviously you didn't believe hard enough. And if you didn't get shot, well, obviously you're a true warrior and the Maji works. There's not really any way to prove the Maji isn't working. Well, these rebels eventually wear the Maji and 75,000 are killed. Not one of the more successful chapters in rebellions against European colonial powers. And we're going to kind of wrap up a little bit of what's happening intellectually. There's the introduction of what's called, quote, scientific racism. We're going to get to the idea of social Darwinism. And what's happened recently around this time is Charles Darwin has published his book about species, right? And how all of the world kind of comes from natural selection. Now, natural selection really comes back to, if you remember back maybe like 7th, 8th grade, you guys learned about Darwin and his finches when he went to the Galapagos. And when he was looking around at the finches, what he started to notice was some of the finches, depending on the island he was on, had different beaks. Because they had different beaks, some had short beaks, which were like fatter and they were stronger. And then some of them had really thin, long beaks that were able to drink nectar. The fatter, stronger ones, crushed nuts and ate like berries and stuff. The finches were well adapted to their environment, allowing them to be more successful at gathering resources to survive. Charles Darwin did not talk about evolution in the sense that a stronger group would automatically win against a weaker group. What he was arguing that there was a fitness or survival of those most fit to their environment would be the ones that are successful in reproducing. Well, with that complicated explanation I just gave, a lot of people didn't understand what he was talking about. And so for some people, they intentionally didn't want to understand what he was talking about. And what they do is take the idea of Darwin's survival of the fittest and make it the survival of the strongest. And they apply it not only to animals, but to humans. Now, what they start to say is, if you look around the world, there are cultures that are amazing. And for many Western Europeans, it was their own culture. For Germans, they would say, look at the German culture and look at how amazing it is. Look at how our history with Martin Luther and the cathedrals and the power and the legacy of us. We can trace ourselves back to the barbarians that invaded Rome, and we have this great Western tradition. And when we look at Africa, we see a lot of huts. We see a lot of people getting owned when we bring machine guns. We see lots of people who are just basically living very like hunter-gatherer, very basic farming lives. And what they start to say is maybe what is happening here is evolution. It is survival of the fittest. In the same way, Europeans start to say, we don't get mad when the cheetah eats the antelope, because if the antelope didn't want to get eaten, it should have just ran faster, which means it wasn't as fit. They start to say that the Europeans are like the cheetahs, and the Africans or the Asians that are being dominated through imperialism really are just the prey to be feasted on. If you are someone who's trying to make a basis for why you're going around the world and taking other people's stuff, you're using this as a justification. What you're saying is that these people, if they would have been smarter, or if they would have been more evolved, or if they would have just done what they should have done with these resources that were just lying around, then they could be like us Western Europeans. But since they didn't, it's not really a bad thing that we go around the world and take it from them. In the same way, if you see little kids with really nice clothes or really nice shoes or really nice toys and they don't really take care of them, sometimes their parents take them away from them because they're not using it properly. That's how the Europeans looked at most of the black and brown populations around the world. And they basically have this guy named Count Joseph Arthur de Gobineau. He kind of takes Darwin's ideas and kind of twists them, and he eventually calls these social Darwinism. And this is going to be a new idea that we're going to keep revisiting, and it's going to influence European politics and European ideals about the rest of the world for a very long time. We're then going to get to kind of wrapping this up with nationalism and anti-colonial movements. Ram Mohan Roy is a Bengali. He's called the father of modern India. He starts to look around and see like, man, the British are really dominating and taking advantage of our stuff in India. He does what the Chinese do with the self-strengthening movement and says, what we need to do is we need to have self-government. We need to get rid of all these British that are directly ruling over us in India, and we need to really go to like an Indian government where we're ruled with Indians taking care of everything. And they're willing to adopt, for example, selected British practices. That's the self-strengthening connection there, where the Chinese, remember we're saying Chinese base with a Western technology, they're willing to say, yeah, we like this British factory stuff and imperialism as long as it's not hurting us. We like these ideas, and we're willing to adopt some of their practices. For example, they banned sati. Sati was a tradition in Hinduism where when a Hindu man died, you would take his body down near the Ganges if you could, and you would set up a pyre or a big pile of sticks, and you'd set it on fire, and you put his body on top, and you would cremate it. Well, sati were women who were seen as very honorable, and what they would do is while their husband was burning, they would throw themselves on the pyre or self-immolate, which means like set themselves on fire and die with their husbands. A lot of more, I want to say like progressive and Western-leaning peoples at this time were saying the British think this is crazy, and while we might understand it as a cultural tradition in Hinduism, we kind of also are starting to see this as a little out of control, and so they actually ban sati from happening, and they actually set up people to stop women from self-immolating. The influence of Enlightenment thought comes into India, and it's often obtained in European universities where many Indians eventually go out into the imperialized areas of the globe, say South Africa, which we'll get to with Gandhi, or England, where many Indians are learning about the Enlightenment, and they're learning about these new ways of understanding the world. And they come back to India and bring the ideas of democracy and the Republic and the ideas of what happened with the American Revolution and the French Revolution. They're learning what those countries did specifically to overthrow their governments. Eventually, they form the people during this time of India, the Indian National Congress in 1885, basically a bunch of guys who decide that they are going to be ready to take over the Indian government if they need to. They're kind of like an organizing group that says, hey, when the British leave, we can totally step into their shoes. We're learning about government. We're enlightened. We're educated. We can do this. We don't need the British. And they give speeches and they rally people around their cause. And in 1916, they join with the All India Muslim League, which is basically the same thing, but with Muslims living in India. All right, so we made it to the end. When you finish studying this chapter, you should be able to do the following. First, identify and explain the motives behind modern imperialism and colonialism. Next, identify key technologies by modern imperialists to create their empires, not just weapons. Next, compare and contrast the British Empire in India with other imperial ventures in Central and Southeast Asia. Then, explain the origins, course, and legacy of the scramble for Africa. Then explain the development of European colonial outposts in Oceania and Pacific Ocean. Outline U.S. imperialism in Latin America and the Pacific. Explain the key events that led to Japan's creation of an East Asian empire. Explain the economic and social changes generated by modern imperialism, including extensive labor migrations. And finally, explain the impact of colonial policies on subject societies and peoples and the formation of anti-colonial movements. Here's your writing assignment, 5-day sentences, blah, 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 blah. First, 19th century imperialists claimed that they were fulfilling a, quote, civilizing mission in their overseas conquests. To what extent was this claim true? Specifically, what significant reforms and changes did the British bring to India? What changes did the British not make? Number 2, the status of indigenous peoples was an important problem for the imperial powers in the 19th century. Compare the British treatment of Australian Aborigines and New Zealand Maoris with the treatment of Native Americans by the U.S. government. That's in your book. You probably should look that up. Number 3, compare the French model of direct rule with the British model of indirect rule. What are the relative advantages and disadvantages for both rulers and their African subjects? Consider this. Under which system would an African find the most opportunities for personal advancement? As always, it's time to reread. I hope you learned a lot. I'll be talking to you guys a little bit later. Good luck on your test. Bye.
What we do here is go back.
Oh,